Is it on? No. Yes, it's on. It's on. Okay, before we go on with another presentation, I don't know if you had the time to see some questions that were there on the final slide of the first presentation. There are some questions for reflection. I've been talking so much that there wasn't time for you to reflect on all of that. But you will get these PowerPoints, and I hope that you can continue your reflections at home. And Mahira will tell you at the end what we are going to do with those reflections. But now I will try to give you some concrete examples of policy approach for basic skills in adults. And they have to do with the country I know the best, Norway, and also with the UK, which some of you know very well too. So if we think of creation and implementation of basic skills policy, where do we start? And I think that what we are doing today is a very good way to start, is to gather stakeholders and make sure that we should actually have done a sort of SWOT analysis. You know what it is. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. But then we need to look at what other countries do, because very often it just gives you ideas. I always say that it's never a question of adopting another country's approach, but adapting only changes one letter. And you can really adapt small gems of, oh, that was a good idea. And even though our situation is completely different, I think we could apply this. Now, I'm going to talk to you about Norway, and the first reaction I get whenever I talk about the system in Norway is, it's easy for you, you have so much money. It's not entirely true, because a lot of the money that Norway has got from the oil, first thing, it's about to end, because we realize we cannot go on extracting oil. And second, it has been put away on funding for pensions. So it's going to be easier to be an old person in 15 years' time in Norway than in other countries in Europe, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we have a lot of money for this type of measures in Norway today. What we do have is an enormous political will. So it is different. So what we need also to look at what tools there are, what tools are there in the country, what can we do with what we have, and what tools can we adapt or translate or buy. A lot of the tools that have been created for basic skills for adults in Europe are, what is it called? Creative Commons. So it's open copyright. So as long as you credit the country that has created it or the institution that has created it, you can get it. And can we learn from other countries' experience? I think the answer is yes, even though you know that your own situation is different. So I would like to start, that happens when you go to another computer. There is a Y that has got hidden. It's Norway, but the picture got too big. So I used to work in Skills Norway. Nowadays, I'm what is called a fake retired person. I'm in retirement and keep on working. Now it's called Skills Norway, but it used to be called Vox. As a Spaniard today, I'm extremely happy that we changed the name. You know what Vox is today in Spain, isn't it? Yeah, so I'm so happy I'm no longer working at Vox. And the history behind this is that in 2000, something akin a miracle happened in Norway. The unions are very, very strong in Norway. And every 2 or 3 years, there's a national bargain about taxes, taxation, and systems. And in this particular national bargain, the unions said to the unions of employers and to the government, forget about higher salaries, forget about more holidays, what we want is more skills. It sounds impossible, it sounds utopic, but it happened. So a new skills reform came about, and it was at the time when we had IELTS and all, which were the predecessors of PIAC. And we knew about the need for basic skills. So a new program was created. And because we had this feeling that the most important target group was always missing, that when we had new programs, we were addressing people who already had a certain level of education, and we were not managing to get to the people who really needed it. We had the idea of going to the workplace and finding at the workplace, often with the help of the unions, the people who could benefit from basic skills training, also because then we gave them the training at the workplace. And it seems a very small thing, but it's extremely different for a person who needs more training to go home at the end of a shift, have dinner with a family, and then have to go out for training. Instead of that, we said, your shift will end 1 hour before the normal time. You will go to training, and you will stay for an extra hour. So the company was paying half of the training in terms of time. The real cost of the teacher was paid by the government. And the person was giving 50% of his or her time, but they were already there. So it was much more motivating. And that is one of the programs that I think you could, if not adapt, and it's called Basic Competence in the Workplace. The main criteria was that it had to be extremely relevant for the individual. So even though some teachers that had not been properly trained started with Ibsen, what we wanted them to learn to read and understand were the safety regulations or the reports they had to write every day and so on. And it was very, very flexible, involving all stakeholders, focusing on motivation and work-based. What we did was to create a program where consortia of workplace plus provider could apply for projects. And that's how it became very flexible. So we said the core is the basic skills competence goals, but how you apply it, how long the project is going to be, when you're having the frequency of the hours of teaching, everything is left to this consortia who is creating a project application. It would be then a provider and the company, or a provider and the cluster of very small SMEs. So it was just very focused on the particular needs of those people. And this still goes on, but we started it as a consequence of a bit of a panic among the policymakers in Norway when the results of these OECD surveys came out, because they realized that 10% of the population in a country that was very proud of their educational system, 10% of the population did not at all have functional skills. And there was a bit of a panic. They started the program, and as I used to say, we built the boat as we sailed. So we found, when we started creating these courses, that there wasn't any consensus on what is level 1 literacy. How do we apply this? How do we teach? So while the program had already started and was going on, we created competence goals, we created guidelines for the teachers, teacher resources, courses for the employers so that they could understand how to address this. We created different tools for testing. There is, for instance, one, sometimes simple is beautiful. There is one test to check the level of literacy of a whole company that is simply, they call it the 3-word chain. If you put together the dog barks in 1 word, and you have a list of these change, maybe 300 such change, changed. And you ask the person to put a pencil line where one word ends and the next begins. And they have to do it quickly. And you have enough that nobody actually can complete the whole list. Then you see the level of literacy of the person. It has one challenge that is very, very relevant for you, and it is, in which language are you going to do it? What is your language? And that is something I forgot from the first part. I'm an absolute 100% advocate of forgetting English in basic education in Malta. Please. English is a foreign language, it's not your language. English is a very poor choice for the whole of humanity as international language because it's hopeless to learn easily to read and write it. And you have a language which is very phonetic. So if you want to increase the literacy from basic education in a geometrical ascendant curve, concentrate on the language that has less prestige but is much easier for literacy. And I know the parents don't want it, and I know you need English, but for literacy purposes, please. Yeah, okay, that was my torch. In the history of this program, we have gone from enormous diversity, because the ideal was that it would be very flexible, to creating some models, because again, it's a question of sustainability and pragmatism. We found out that we were spending an enormous amount of money on this program because every project had to be analyzed and scrutinized by experts to find out whether it was a good idea, because they were all so different. So from the experience we gathered in that phase, we could create some standards, and that made it much easier to analyze. And we created some indicators of how much money we were prepared to pay per person, instead of just saying the sky's the limit, apply, and we will consider. So there's always this, there needs to be a flexibility between trying to be very, very flexible and being pragmatic enough that the program is sustainable. But at the beginning, they were just projects every year, and we were dependent on the next government and the next budget to say how much money we would have and whether we were going to do it. Now it's a program, now it's a given that this exists and it will go on. And also, we went for clustering of SMEs because we realized that the companies that were applying had a certain size and we were not reaching everybody. So we started clustering.
Can you define SME?
Oh.
I mean, in terms of numbers.
It's difficult, and actually we say in Norway that we don't have SMEs, we have micro. But this is my definition. I'm not sure that Norway, but I would think 10, 12 people is an SME, the others are medium size. And the problem, as you will know, was that the employers could have the will to let the people get training, but they couldn't afford to let this person go. So, but the flexibility of the program is such that if the employee agreed that they needed the training, then we didn't have this system where we didn't use the time of work. So if the shift was from 8 to 4, you need the training, you can stay at work with other employees, but from 4 to 6, so that it didn't mean so much. It is possible if the will is there.
There seems to be, you seem to have this natural inclination towards taking away the workers from the workplace to a training spot. And they will not come.
That is...
Because SMEs are not unionized, in Malta at least. They do not have any union representing them, the workers, I mean. So how can you reach the adults that need basic learning skills?
I realize it's a problem. Taking the people out of the company is a very bad idea. If you want, we have good results in many countries from work-based training. So it is a very good idea to let it at least happen in the context of work. It doesn't need to be exactly at the workplace. I don't know if this exists in Malta, but well, unions are very strong in Norway, so for us it's easier to think in those terms. But when we created clusters, it wasn't always for unions. It could be, for instance, there is a pretty small town in Norway where all the shops along the main street had created an association of shops along the main shopping street. And that association was the one that went together with a provider to create courses for the people. And what they did was they didn't involve the employers as such. It wasn't in working time, but it was in the context of the fact that you're employed in that shop. And that was motivating, and they went together with colleagues from other shops. So it's again, when I say it's a question of attitude, if you think of how can we create clusters? How can we involve the fact that you're employed in this SME as a need? Because, for instance, it's the content of the teaching will be related to your work, and that in itself creates a link.
What about online learning?
And a lot of online learning, thank you. Because I was saying now in the break that if we think of sustainability and if we think of flexibility, we really need to get working online. And nowadays, there are so good systems that are cheap. If only we get the educators to such a high level of digital skills for themselves that not only can they use the tools, but reflect on the didactic use of the tools, which is a different, much higher level. And we need to get there. So, but we don't have a lot of time, so I will go ahead. So these became a Skills Plus, the whole program. And nowadays, it's not only, and that is also an experience, we realized that workplace learning was extremely valuable, but then what about inclusion of many foreign nationals living now in Norway who were still not employed? So because the program was very successful, now it's not only at work. Now it's also for NGOs and for voluntary sector, and the same type of courses can be done there. But I'll go ahead because I want to tell you about what happened when the OECD has a program called Skills Strategy, where they go to a country and analyze the whole system. It's very expensive, it's OECD. And they analyze the whole system for skills acquisition, how it fits with the needs of work and employment and economy, and how it's integrated and so on. Norway was the first that said we want this to happen in the country, and the diagnostic report said there's a lot that is very good here, but there is a lack of one whole of government approach to skills. So again, the fragmentation. And when we created the action plan resulting from this, we realized we needed to create a Norwegian strategy for skills policy. And in the document where Norway presented this to the Commission as a result of their development, it says, It aims to ensure that individuals and businesses have the skills that gives Norway a competitive business sector, an efficient and sound public sector, and an inclusive labor market. But then it also said that when they were working on that, the government would involve everybody, and the strategy process, third line, the strategy process is thus not intended as a process in which the social partners and others only provide input, but where they work together. So the whole process involved 5 ministries, all the unions, the umbrella organizations for NGOs in the educational system, and everybody that was a stakeholder. They worked together with the ministry, which, from my knowledge of European ministries, is revolutionary. Because ministries tend to say, have your say, and then we will work. But here it wasn't have your say and we will create it. Here it was, this is our draft, comment it. Can you take care of that part of the draft? What do you think of this? And they were really creating it together. And because they did, when the document was signed, there were signatories from who were the ministers, but all the others were there. These are the main unions. These, the Prime Minister, the Sami Parliament, and the Norwegian Association for Adult Learning, the umbrella organization for all educations, they all own the document. And that, I think, is something that can be adopted in other countries. That you really, when you're creating a new strategy for adult education or for literacy, you try to get everybody really involved, not fake involved. So this was the Norwegian example. If we go to England and Wales, it will be very short because I've already told you about it, because I left my structure. But it has to do with the citizens' curriculum that is presented in this OER, the Open Educational Resource in EPALE, that is the base for this workshop today. So if you go to EPALE, you will see videos and PowerPoints and research reports and so on about the citizens' curriculum, and I really recommend it to you because it was really innovative and it was created to meet the need which they saw as not only an educational need, it's the need of a vulnerable target group, which is extremely heterogeneous, but which very often has a commonality in the needs in the sense that they have challenges in social sphere, challenges for inclusion, challenges in health, challenges as parents, and so on. And they put really the learner at the center, which is really revolutionary, and found that the results were both successful and cost-effective, and that is what is almost anti-intuitive. We don't really believe that you then need to put much more money into something like that to create results. But they have the proof that what they invested in education of this type got as a result enormous savings in other areas of the public cost. So Learning and Work, which is an institution, for those of you in the education sector, you may have known it as NIAS. It's what they were called before. And they are members of the EBSN. And they are the ones that have created this. More flexible, creative, and innovative models are needed to engage and motivate learners. It's what we were talking about before. It's this vulnerable target group who doesn't want to go back to school or adapt to our formal system of education and to the pattern that we have in our minds about what they need. They want to be able to form the offer that really meets their needs. And as long as you have a base of a common curricula that you can go to, you can really adapt it to the needs of the people. Motivate learners and meet the challenge of poor basic language, because that's where the oral language comes in. They don't have enough vocabulary even. Literacy, numeracy, and digital skills in the context of a change that is making these basic skills constantly more needed. So the gap is increasing because the need is increasing and they are not going anywhere. So all of these was involved in the local context and with learner involvement. And the financial part is incredibly important. Often they are in poverty only because they don't know how to manage the money. So there are lots of documentation that you can access, and that is where we come back to what you can do. There are many lessons that can be assimilated, and then you can export it, adapt it to your own context. The circumstances can be very different, but if you see that the same issue is there, if you think creatively about it, you will find the Maltese way of doing this. So you don't need to reinvent. And that is where the EBSN is trying to put together all the knowledge from the different countries. And some of the examples that we use, you have created. Because it was when the Upskilling Pathways recommendation came out, the Directorate created a workshop for companies to raise the awareness of the issue about companies. I don't know of any country that was so quick. So there are things that can be done in Malta that other countries will be learning from, and you can learn from other countries. But you need to use EPALE, you need to use our OER, and you are extremely welcome to, do I have it here? I think so, to pilot MOOC. I always joke that when it comes to adult learning, we shouldn't call them MOOCs because the masses are not there. It's an OOC. It's an open course that will start actually next week. And it's free of charge. You don't need to do a lot, just to read, reflect, write, discuss with other people. It goes on for 4 weeks. And you can write to me if you want more information. Thank you. Yeah, questions?
So I think we still have some more time.
Oh, okay, yeah, perfect. Yeah, questions and comments? Or what we could do, Mahira, if you can help me with the first presentation, the last slide on the first presentation, because that's where I have the questions that I hoped we could have time to discuss.
Graciela,
Yeah.
there are different stakeholders, some who work on provision and some who work on policy. So I think it would be useful if we have a discussion also on what initiatives that are being done or challenges that are being faced, because it's an opportunity for us to discuss as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a little bit of what I had here in the last one, is what do you think are the main challenges and the main strengths in Malta today? You do have a lot of initiatives. How well, that's the first one. How well do you know about all the initiatives that are going on in Malta in this field? Is there enough communication among the stakeholders? Do you know what other people are doing? How could you solve that? If the answer is no, I see people shaking their heads. How could you solve that?
Do we need to solve that?
Okay, tell us why not.
Because working at the community level, it's important to duplicate.
Sorry?
If you're working at the community level, an
Yeah.
NGO or an association working in a small community, does not need to know what the other NGOs are doing.
You haven't convinced me.
But, I mean, if you're working in the field and you're working with a small group of people,
Yeah,
and they have particular needs,
yeah,
you must address those needs.
yeah.
So the intentions and the demands are different. And they may be replication of ideas and works, and provision.
I do see your point, but it is quite possible that even though the needs are not exactly the same, there can be at least 5 or 6 other groups in the rest of Malta that have maybe 80% of the same characteristics. I think that things can be done quite easily to add up to the experience so that you're not inventing the wheel all the time. I know that, for instance, in Norway, people who are teaching alphabetizing really from scratch, so initial literacy for adults, have created a Facebook group where they just write, of course it should have been on Nepali, but it's on Facebook, where they just write, I have this challenge. Have you met this? What are you doing? So creating communities of practice doesn't need to mean, because I realize your objection is you don't need to be extremely informed about everything that goes on. But what you need is to have channels of communication that ensure that if people are working in similar situations, they can learn from each other, they can cooperate in creating materials, for instance, in online courses. If you can, that will happen because the group is so heterogeneous. Imagine that you have in a village that is, I don't know about distances here, it's probably only 30 kilometers away from another village, but you have the same type of candidate, of learner, and they could profit from a tool that needs to be created by our colleague here who has learned programming. And I've been having a very interesting, maybe you get tasks. So if we can create a small digital tool that serves learner A in that corner of the country and learner B here and learner C, you need to know about the different needs, you need to know about the ideas of different learners, and more, as I said, change of attitude doesn't cost money. More and more have teachers who are facilitators of learning instead of providers of learning that you pour into a head. So we need tools that we could create at national level over the whole of Malta, and then different people in the group will be using different tools, and the teacher can facilitate this because they are in a community of practice where they are learning with other teachers how to use those tools. That is why it's a sort of, it's not information at theoretical level of this is happening, this is happening, this is happening, but who can I talk to who is my peer and who may be facing the same needs? Does that resound with some of you who are teaching? Yes?
And I think it is also important to know what others are doing if you position the student at the center.
Yeah.
Because very often they move from one institution or NGO to the other because they are walking through different phases in life, and each time they end up starting from the same point, which is very frustrating and very demotivating because they come to believe that they are actually not making any progress at all. So I think if we really put the learners at the center, we need to acknowledge where they are starting at and recognize where they ended in the previous phase. Otherwise, and the risk of not knowing what others are doing is believing that what we're doing is the optimal program and replicate it all over in different places.
I so agree, and that is why I would go back now to your need to create a framework so that you know what people need and where they are at. But it also reminds me of a pretty revolutionary idea that they had in the UK, but that I think that they left it because they thought it was costly. But just imagine this. It was called the individual learning number. Imagine that each learner, you included, it's for the whole country. Each person has a number, which is a sort of bank account, which is where you collect all your qualifications, but qualifications can be of the type of practice in a company, or small course, whatever. Everything that can be documented towards validation of prior learning, you can give the course provider or your boss or whoever can document your learning, you give a number. The way you say, pay me to this bank account. So they put information, documentation, in a bank account for learning, for experience. The only person that can really access that list of qualifications is you, because it's your ownership. But completely without a personal reference, so anonymized, it can be aggregated for the purpose of research. So that you know that people who have gone through this tend to tend this, but you don't know if it was Joe or Maggie. And the person can then take printouts of all of that collection, choosing what to include and what not, because it's your own property. So imagine that every person that has gone through adult education centers could have the access to a whole documentation of all types of courses and use it to access more learning. And if a country can do it easily, it is Malta. You already have it? Tell me about it.
No, it's
Really?
going to start this year, yeah, that you have a sort of a portfolio of all the qualifications you actually accumulate through life.
Is it digital?
Yes, it will be digital, and you will have access to it. So even simple things like when you apply for a job, you can actually take with you what is needed for that particular job and print out. And it's very secure. Yeah. And also we have another initiative, which is a good practice, I think, that we actually accredit even non-formal programs and peg them to EQF. So we have a sort of some method of translating what is a particular qualifications. The next step would probably be imposing diploma supplements or certificate supplement even for.
And this is secret. This is really the property of the person, and
Yes,
you cannot
it is,
you
it
cannot
is, it is.
access a learner
It is.
list.
It's a single ledger.
Yes. Yeah.
No one can change it.
Yeah, exactly.
This is wonderful. I thought it was just an idea, but you've done it.
No, yeah. Actually, taking up on a point you mentioned previously, I think fragmentation is one of the biggest problems we have in Malta. We have in the compulsory education, few people are aware of the National Strategy for Lifelong Learning. They see it as a sort of, it's not for us, it's for adult learning. And when people think of adult learning in the compulsory sector, it's actually senior citizens. And it's the other way around. And the strategies don't necessarily tally, so there's a lot of unlearning going on, so it's a waste of resources. There are a lot of waste of resources. We have, small island, one would think that efficiency would be a priority, but it's not really. Each group is doing their own job, many times replicating. I agree that sometimes the replication of learning outcomes is good for reinforcement, but replicating of exact programs
It needs
is
to be
inefficient.
intended replication.
Yeah, and sometimes other people you have to accept that do it better than you do. So if another person does it better, another organization does it better than you do, then it's a good idea to sort of delegate that work. Plus, not knowing leads to stagnation, and sometimes you do not develop, and educators do not develop because they weren't exposed to other ideas of how to do things. And we have a cultural tendency of, once you learn something, you learned it, and full stop, you don't update yourself. There is, and it's even in teachers sometimes, we find it. So they are excellent in the beginning, but sometimes they sort of not keep updating themselves. So fragmentation is a big problem in my opinion, and we should make an effort to know what other people are going on. And I think it's quite easy in Malta because we're quite a small country and we tend to know each other.
Yeah, it's, what we're doing here today is part of that.
Exactly. Sometimes we get caught in work, and so we tend to focus on ours because obviously you're responsible directly for your work and you forget other things, but I think it's an essential. Just one other item, it's also important, I mean, the motivation of adults. In Malta, I think awareness is poor because few people feel the need to update themselves. The economy is going well, so they don't need. Why should I study or why should I learn literacy if I am actually earning more than a teacher? So there's little motivation. And also, even when the economy wasn't doing that well, sort of part-time, you could still, the motivation isn't there. We need to work a lot on creating awareness and motivating them, not just pounds, shillings, and pence, but as you mentioned before, the wider aspect of it. What will it do for you? Why should you do it? And this should be emphasized more, I think.
Thank you. Yes.
It's not a Maltese problem, it's a European problem. But there's a misconception of the definition of learning. Many adults think that learning is the accumulation of knowledge, which is not. I mean, we are now talking about incidental learning, informal learning that happens in the workplace. And this knowledge comes out if you are working, as you said, in a community of practice, in a community of learning.
Yeah. That is what we need to do. And you need to think also that there are, nowadays, the media can be a tool to influence this change of attitude. If you create discussions on Maltese television about this, let people see what the challenges are. But back to this personal number, which has blown me away because I didn't think it existed in any country.
It doesn't exist in any country.
No, but you exist here. This is a country. I mean, applause. But how do you document basic skills without a framework? So that is a challenge you now have.
To be fair, the blockchain is very much driven by higher education.
Yes.
So
you need to expand it.
that needs still to
definitely.
be
It's
wider.
just the first year.
Yeah.
It's definitely more awareness that there's.
Yeah, you really use it because then you have a tool. Yeah, sorry. then you have a tool to start putting together all that we consider adult learning. It can be part of your change of attitude, is to say, when we do have such a fantastic tool, let's not use it only for the upper echelons of the EQF, but for all of it. And add to it sideways also languages, skills that have to do with handicrafts. Everything should be in it.
And actually, we had something similar for some times now in the construction with the skills card. So an integration of these ideas would be great because there are other industries who had this accumulation for, I think it's 4 years now.
It's wonderful.
Now, I don't know if NCHFP are still here, but it was meant to be now extended even to other sectors.
They're waiting for the occupational standard.
So what I had been thinking of as questions for reflection, if we had the time to get in groups and so on and talk, was how aware do you think all relevant multi-stakeholders are of the basic skills issue as what has been presented here today? sort of what is functional literacy and how many people do not have a level of functional literacy. What are the main challenges for you? What issues should you prioritize now? And what do you think is your own role and your institution's role in this? And since we don't have time now to discuss them in groups and so on, I have suggested to Mahira that you could be encouraged to discuss them in 1 or 2 weeks from now on a palais. Will you explain?
So hello again. The idea is to think,
Thank you.
Graciela, first of all, for being here and